Hello all, this is Carlos Garrido, and what I want to do today is talk to you about some of the central points in an article I published a few weeks ago called A Critique of the Misunderstandings Concerning Marx's Base and Superstructure Spatial Metaphor. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but the topic of the essay is both simple and difficult. It's a topic that like I said in the title, I think has been misunderstood a lot. But the topic itself is one. It deals with the question of determination as the form of relationship that it exists between different different spheres of the Marxist analysis. So I postulate that it exists within the relationship of the political, legal, ideological superstructure and its determining economic foundation, right? So that's a more general approach, but it also exists within the moments of that economic foundation itself, between the relationship of the determining productive moment and the other moments of distribution, exchange, and consumption. It also appears with relationship to material conditions and consciousness, right? So the question of free will is involved. But this is there's a famous metaphor that is used in Marx's 1859 contribution to the critique of political economy, which is what I call the dress rehearsal for Capital. That's published 8 years after. But in the short text, Marx has a preface where he's basically reflecting on some of the advances that him and Engels have been able to make in the last 20 or so years working together. And within this description, which has been archetypical in the 20th century to teach people historical materialism, within this description, there's a famous metaphor, spatial metaphor, that has been used as a great pedagogical tool, sense, and that's the metaphor of the base and the superstructure. Now, in the English text that I have, the word that appears is foundation, the economic foundation, but I guess base sounds cleaner for the relationship. Either way, this spatial metaphor of the economic foundation and the legal, political, ideological superstructure is supposed to enlighten us into to understand the relationship between the economic sphere of society and the sphere that exists after the economic sphere, the political, legal, ideological sphere, so the realm of ideas, which, if you saw the video that I did on the state, includes institutions like the school, the church, family, and amongst other things. So this is an important question, right? Because it depending on the sphere in which we're at, interpreting the question of determination is depending on what place should we put a bit more focus on. Now, I argue in the essay that this is a question that has been often misunderstood. And there's two central failures that I see going on. The first one, which is one that Marx and Engels have already criticized, that they saw coming since their time, is economic reductionism. Now, what this position holds is that any event that happens in the superstructure, whether it be political, legal, a class taught at a school, any event, can be easily reduced to, can easily have its cause in the relations of production, right? Now, this is a really vulgar misconstruing of Marxism. And this is something that Engels and Marx fought against. This is something that 20th century theorists like Althusser, Lukács, Lenin fought against. But nonetheless, this is the predominant interpretation by non-Marxists about what Marxism is, right? The Weberian conception of Marxism is basically that. Out of this conception, which has rarely ever been in Marxist circles, grows the boogeyman of academia, which is economic reductionism, right? We've heard probably more often the term class reductionism. This refers to the same sort of relation that one can just get in a relationship of two or more factors and reduce the determined factors or the determined factors to that one factor. And people are rightly skeptical of this because this is, like I said, a simplistic interpretation. But this is not the perspective that Marx or Engels promote. Now, out of a reaction to this economic reductionism, a few perspectives arise. And maybe it's wrong to group them all together, but I will be doing that for the sake of demonstrating how they're at both extremes. One of them is that there's a mutual interdetermination between factors, right? So this position would hold that in relation to the spatial metaphor, that the superstructure determines the base as much as the base determines the superstructure, right? So in a dialectical fancy, both parts determine each other. Another reaction would be to say that, well, there's no determination at all. All you have is factors that influence other factors, and they mutually influence each other. Now, this might sound correct to a lot of people, and in some sense, this is how the lens of intersectionality functions, right? You have these different factors that they supposedly meet at this one point, and these different factors are mutually determining. They're mutually influential. You can separate the analysis of this with the analysis of this, and you can't separate them. To some extent, what I argue is that both misinterpretations are partly right. And now this might sound absurd, but I argue that it is compatible. It is compatible to say that there's one determining factor, and also to say that these other factors, which are determined, can also have an influential role in that which determines it, right? So my argument, which might seem incompatible, is the one that was promoted by Althusser. He popularized the concept of relative autonomy, that the superstructure had a relative autonomy in relationship to the base, and with that relative autonomy, he was able to influence the base. But before Althusser, Engels already addressed the question pretty head on. So there's these 1890 letters right before Engels dies that are published together as Engels on Historical Materialism. And specifically, I'm going to be dealing with what's usually published as the first one, which is the one to Conrad Schmidt. And in this letter, Engels is elucidating how we should think about the question of determination. And he does so by analyzing different sets of relationship. He starts first by analyzing the relationship of production to the realm of exchange, right? So the market. Then he analyzes the commodity market's relationship to the money market, which grows out of it. He later analyzes head on the one that we want to deal with, which is the relationship of economics to the political, legal, ideological superstructure. Now, how does he talk about it, right? Well, he says, and this is in the first relation, he says, production is in the last instance the decisive factor. However, as soon as the commercial exchange of commodities separates itself from actual production, it follows a movement which, although as a whole still dominated by production, in turn obeys its particular details and within the sphere of its general dependence, its own laws. He says pretty much the same thing right after for the relationship of the commodity market to the money market that grows out of it. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is the truly dialectical position that says What's a both and? You have one factor which predominates, and that's the level of production. It predominates the level of exchange, right? You can't talk about exchange without talking about production. That's what bourgeois economists do. But you also can't just say that everything can be explained through an analysis of production, right? You have to analyze how it is that the level, whether it's of commodity exchange, the money market, the superstructure in general, how is it that these spheres are able to develop their own independence within the boundaries that were determined by it, by the existing mode and relations of production? And that's what the Marxist analysis is about. It doesn't reject determination, and it also it doesn't say that we can reduce everything to economics. It doesn't reduce it. It's not a hard determinism, right? In philosophy, we have this distinction between hard and soft determinism. Soft is known as compatibilist, a compatibilist approach. So the Marxist position doesn't reduce things to economics, right, or to the most influential factor, but it also doesn't say that these factors just interpenetrate each other, that they are equally influential for each other or equally determining for each other. There's one factor that's predominant in this relationship, but within that level of predominance, whether we want to use the word determination, whether we want to use the word conditioning, within that level of predominance, there is a relative independence. That's the concept that Engels used. Althusser, 70 years after, says relative autonomy. That's what we use now. But Engels already said in 1890, a relative independence. Relative independence. There's a relative independence of the superstructure with the economic base. What does that mean? That the factor that determines creates the boundaries for the determined factor. But within those boundaries, it is free to move as it wants. And as he said, it is free to create its own laws. And in that process, in that activity that is relatively autonomous, relative because it's within the boundaries that the determining factor set for it, and autonomous because within those boundaries it is autonomous. It is free to act how it wants to. In that activity, emergent qualities develop that allow it to reactively influence the factor that determined it. So, what does this mean concretely? Well, that the superstructure presupposes an economic foundation which has set a historical boundary on it. But within this determined space, the superstructure is relatively autonomous, enough so that it becomes capable of emergent qualities which have a reactive, or as Engels states in his essay or in his letter, a counteractive influence upon that which determines it. So, philosophically, this position can be labeled as compatibilist. It is a soft determination which allows for the conditioned autonomous expression of that which is determined. Now, again, this can be applied across the board, whether we're talking in general about the economic foundation and the legal, political, ideological superstructure, whether we're talking about the material conditions a person experiences in their life and their consciousness, right? So, therefore, although the determination of the economic foundation on the superstructure is not absolute, what we would call in philosophy hard determinism or fatalistic, neither is it non-existent. Engels critiques both positions. He argues first, and this is a quote, it is altogether pedantic to seek economic causes for all things. He asserts that in doing so, Paul Barth is, quote, contending against windmills. In other words, it's pretty dumb to try to reduce everything to economics. This is not the Marxist position. So this boogeyman, push it out. But he also criticizes the position which altogether either denies determination or places the primary source of determination on the wrong variable, as participating in what he called ideological conceptions, whereby the real relationship is inverted and placed on its head, treating the effect for the cause, right? So I first started by postulating two misunderstandings of this relationship. The one that tries to reduce the superstructure to the base, and the one that says, no, it's a mutual relation of either determination or influence, whatever you want to use. He's saying no. He says, this is a quote, "What all these gentlemen lack is dialectics. All they ever see is cause here, effect there. They do not see that this is a bare abstraction, that in the real world such metaphysical polar opposites exist only in crisis, that the whole great produces and develops itself in the form of reciprocal action, to be sure, of very unequal forces, in which the economic movement is far and away the strongest, most primary and decisive. They do not see that here nothing is absolute, everything is relative. For them, Hegel never existed, yours truly." So, the economic factor is the determining factor, but it is not an absolute determination. It is not a hard determinism, which is the language that philosophers of free will use, which means that it determines, it sets the boundaries for that which is determining it, but within that sphere, there's a relative independence, and from that, it can influence that which determines it. Now, why is this practically important? Well, first of all, because it's important to get the theory right, to understand what it says so that you can avoid the mistakes that many academics have of calling Marxism reductionist. And you can also avoid the reactions which try to do the previous phenomena of equal interrelated determination. But beyond that, there's a practical importance, right? Where should our focus be? Should it be on the factor that is determined and that influences? Or should it be on the factor that determines? I think it should be on the factor that determines. Now, it shouldn't only be there, right? Engels later on in the other letter says, Marx and I, because of the limited time we had and because of the lack of focus that was taking place by socialists, we focused only on economics, and that was truly a shame. We should have focused on other things. We should focus on other things. We should focus on political analysis, legal analysis, analysis of the superstructure. But ever since the new left, basically the only analysis has been of cultural studies, has only basically been of the superstructure. And we have to remember that the economic foundation is the determining factor. We have to analyze that concretely. We have to do analysis of how it is that the relations of production today take place. And from that analysis, interpret the superstructure. We can't just use what Marx wrote. We have to use his methodology, do it for our own context. So the practical importance is this, that economic analysis should be at the core of every other analysis. If it's not, then we're absolutely missing, right? But we shouldn't reduce every other analysis we have to that economic analysis that we do. The problem is that today, no one is doing the economic analysis, or rarely is anyone doing it. It's more easy, it's more sexy to talk about the other stuff rather than talking about concretely what's being produced, how is it being produced, what are the relations of production. So that's the practical importance, right? And this is why theory is important to understand and to understand correctly. because it always has a practical significance. Thank you for watching. This is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marx signing out.